So this lecture will look at the expansion of the civil rights movement, and we're continuing our discussion of women's rights. This particular lecture, though, will focus on the more modern movement. So last week we looked at what I called the early movement. So that was really looking at the 19th century or the 1800s and carried you into the 1920s. Again, keep in mind that up until that time, that was a time of economic boom for the United States. It was a time of industrialization. The 1920s was really kind of the height of our economy. Women had earned the right to vote. The 1920s was, relatively speaking, a pretty great time for women's rights and definitely steps forward in the women's rights movement. Well, the 1920s, as you know, when you look at the chronology, right, is followed by the 1930s. And this decade is really identified as the Great Depression, right? This is what defines the decade or these 10 years of the 1930s. And the Great Depression was really a step backwards for women and in the struggle for women's rights. The 1930s, really the struggle for survival overtook the struggle for equality. So it's no longer about setting up equal rights for women, it's just straight up survival. We see during this time women really kind of revived or brought back traditional home crafts. So you see women doing things like sewing and making things in the home again. And also we see that traditional female jobs during the 1930s went to men because of this idea that it's men's job to support their families. And so there was not a sense of women employment. There was not large spread women employment anymore, but any kind of traditional female jobs, shopkeepers or store clerks and secretary jobs, anything like that, those types of jobs ended up going back to men. The 1930s was followed by the 1940s, and if the 1930s was really defined by the Great Depression, the decade of the 1940s is really defined by World War II. World War II, while the Great Depression in the 1930s was a step backwards for women, the 1940s and World War II is really identified as a step forward for women. During this time, 15 million Americans left to serve in the armed forces or in the military. And it's at that time that 6 million women joined the labor force. 6 million women went to work. There were a lot of critics, a lot of people who were opposed to this idea. They argued that this really put a lot of stress on the home and stress on families. They called the kids of women who worked latchkey kids, right? They'd be locked in their homes while their moms were off at work. But the reality was women were working, and it was a big step forward. Women assumed non-traditional factory jobs. This picture on the right here is Rosie the Riveter, right? She becomes an iconic figure of this decade of the 1940s. While they took over jobs that men were doing, they received 60% less pay, and there was no job security. So when the men returned for more, the men got their jobs back, and during 1944 to 1946, 4 million women lost their jobs. So we had 6 million women enter the workforce at the beginning of the war. By the end of the war, only about 2 million women of them 2 million of those women still have their jobs at the end of the war. But what we see during this time is we do see women being able to perform and demonstrating that they're able to perform the same types of jobs that men were able to do. Right here in the Bay Area, we didn't have Rosie the Riveter, but the kind of character that was used here was Wendy the Welder. And in Richmond, in the shipyards, they were full of women at the Kaiser shipyards welding ships together all throughout World War II. The 1950s is the next decade, and this is often called the post-war era, right, after the war. And if the 1940s were a big step forward, the 1950s was a huge step backward for women. As those men came home and took their jobs back, women were encouraged to go back into the home, right? During this time, during this big step backwards, there was really a restricted social mobility. In fact, we were nearly back to those 19th century standards we talked about, that cult of true womanhood, right? The piety and the purity and the domesticity and the submissiveness. We really see a lot of these kind of ideals back and being imposed upon women. Propaganda really encouraged women to return home after the war. There was this idea that women's place, once again, was in the home and having babies. It's during this time that we have the baby boom generation. You have in the upper right-hand corner here, this is Dr. Spock. He was a very famous doctor of the time, and he's with a family that had quintuplets. And the baby boom generation was this generation that's my parents' generation, where people were having a lot of babies, and women were encouraged to stay home, have babies, and raise them at home. Popular culture really reinforced this idea. You have education enforcing it. In the middle here, right here, this is in Housekeeping Monthly. This is also, this type of thing was printed in 1950s textbooks. So students would read this idea of how to be a good wife. It was also reinforced in television and movies, but this idea that women belonged in the home and women's job was to support her husband and raise her kids at home. And any woman who was outside of that was really seen as not a true woman again. And so we see these pressures once again put upon women. Whether they wanted to stay home or not, there was this pressure put upon them to fit into this particular lifestyle. Later in the 1950s and into the 1960s, we see a shift, and we do see this dissatisfaction. Now, this isn't among all women, but we certainly see a number of women starting to speak out against that kind of stereotypical 1950s housewife idea. In the 1960s, Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. And in this book, she identifies the dissatisfaction of so many women. And she interviews women and tells their stories and talks about how women are really dissatisfied with their role. They're unfulfilled. They're not feeling like they're really doing anything for society. In 1962, a survey was taken, and the survey shows that 92% of mothers in 1962 hoped for different lives for their daughters. So again, it's a evidence of this dissatisfaction that women at the time, that even though they're raising these kids, they're really hoping that their daughters have a different life than they do. And so there's really a sense of frustration and rising frustration that takes up in, this is where we see kind of the women's movement of feminism really begin. And so now we're into kind of the more modern movement that really began in the 1960s and 70s and is still carrying on today. And so here's where we're going to look once again at these modern issues. First are the social equality, right? The social issues. There's the equality in gender relationships. And we've talked about this a little bit in class, right? But one of the things that we've talked about is this idea of a double standard, okay? That sexually active men versus sexually active women have different expectations, right? Women with a lot of partners are called names. They're considered dirty. They're considered impure, going back to this idea of purity, as opposed to men who have had a lot of sexual partners. That's kind of what it's considered to being a man. Often, and so we see this double standard exist within relationships. And again, I want to emphasize here, if you remember the definition of feminism, is that men and women are equal. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about social equality, is equality in gender relationships. We have seen some improvements in this category. Some states have passed what we call community property laws. California is one of those. And this has to do with a marriage. And so a community property law states that regardless of what people come into a marriage with, if a couple gets divorced, all property is split 50-50. So all property, regardless of what the couple comes with, regardless of what the man or the wife or partner A and partner B, regardless of what they come into the marriage with, if a divorce happens, all property is split equally. The only exception to that is if a prenuptial agreement has been signed. In that case, that prenup is going to say partner A came with this much, partner B came with this much. If the couple splits up, they each leave with that same amount in the end. The idea of community property laws is really to protect stay-at-home moms or housewives. They didn't work, and so if the husband or anybody, if a divorce happens, right, then the woman would be left with nothing in a divorce. And so the community property law really protects the wives who were staying at home to support their husbands. Another topic that we have to talk about when we're looking at feminism and women's rights is the idea of sexual harassment. Even today, sexual harassment is still not really taken seriously as an issue. Sexual harassment can mean anything from a comment toward a woman regarding her clothing, her looks, her body, her any rumors about her sexual activities, anything like that can be considered sexual harassment. And even today, this issue is still not taken seriously, and it's something that really affects women and oftentimes their ability to work or to participate equally in society. Another topic that falls under this social issue that we're dealing with today is the issue of domestic violence. This really stems from the virtue of submission, right? There's this idea that it's if a woman's supposed to submit to the man in her life, and so it's her fault. She did something to deserve this abuse because ultimately she's under the care of this man. And so that's where this stems from. But 25% of women have experienced some kind of domestic violence in their life. In the United States today, on average, 3 women and 1 man are killed every day by an intimate partner. So again, please understand that domestic violence is not only men against women, but it's primarily or predominantly men against women. Women receive the brunt or the majority of the domestic violence. 1 in 5 females report physical or sexual abuse. So please understand that a lot of people will admit in a survey that they've been sexually or physically abused, but many women do not actually report it. So only about 20%, only 1 in 5 of those who receive the abuse actually report it. 3 of the 4 women who reported rape in particular say it was by an intimate partner. So these are by people who they know. This is not like a random stranger. And again, you need to understand, these 3 of 4 women who report the rape, these are only the women who actually come forward and say they were raped. One of the reasons why we see domestic violence and rape in particular such a big issue today and women not reporting it is because it is really hard to convict. If a woman comes forward and says she was raped, it's very difficult to get a conviction. Often it ends up being a he said, she said, right? If it goes to court, he says that this, she says that, and usually there are no witnesses, and so it's difficult. The other thing that you need to understand is if a woman comes forward and reports a rape or reports a domestic abuse, particularly rape, oftentimes in court, women's sexual history is usually used as part of the evidence against her. The fact that she's had multiple partners becomes something held against her in court as evidence justifying the rape, justifying her sexual advancements, if you will, or her sexual history. She was asking for it defense, right? Because she's slept with all these other people, of course she wanted to sleep with me too. And while this may sound absolutely crazy to some of us, this is the history of domestic violence, and this defense, the she was asking for it defense, has absolutely been used, and usually, often, juries have found in favor of the man. Okay, and so many women just don't even come forward because it's not recognized. Until recently, rape has really not been taken seriously by law enforcement or domestic violence either. There was kind of that idea, right, that you allow a man to take care of his business in his home. And so there wasn't, law enforcement really didn't get involved. But we do have more people reporting the abuse. And so as more people are coming forward saying this is an issue, we have more people looking into this. The other thing we've really seen too is college campuses have just recently started acknowledging that rape is a big deal. It's been happening since the history of college campuses, but we just now in 2015 have started seeing things and started seeing change and women coming forward and reporting it. You see these campaigns say yes means yes. So it's no longer this idea of, hey, no means no, but it's beyond, it's more than that. It's she has to give consent. Okay, if a girl's passed out, that does not mean that you can have sex with her, right? Only yes means yes. Only if somebody has given you their consent does that mean you can have sex with that person. And this is a campaign that's just now started. So these are issues that we're currently dealing with regarding women's rights. And the other thing that we have talked about in class as well is women in media. And women in media, I mean, this is just a major issue when we talk about the reality of social equality between men and women today. Women are portrayed as sex objects in the media. Bodies are objectified. I mean, in many of these commercials, there's not even a face, or you can't see the face or the head in many of these images, right? It's just the body. It's an object, and it's a sexual object. Out of Canada's Centre for Digital Media and Literacy, they said when women are constantly shown as sex objects rather than agents, consistently depicted in demeaning and degrading ways, and consistently shown as submissive, the result is to condone and support violence against women and anti-woman attitudes. So these images, whether we think they're horrible, but they get into our brains and they give us some sort of thought about what a woman should be and what to expect from women as well. Not only does it perpetuate this idea of objectification of women and looking at women as sex objects, but it also continues or perpetuates harmful stereotypes or impossible norms, right? It promotes this unhealthy and unnatural body images. It suggests that there's kind of this idea of a right or a normal body. And please keep in mind that this is absolutely a problem with men too, but they're not as objectified as often nor as violently as we see with women. But you can see in a lot of these pictures, right? Some of these pictures you've seen in the clips we've watched in class. But all of this, as you can imagine, contributes to concerns about body image for women. I mean, these pictures here, right, this one here and this one here, this was photoshopped. And there's absolutely, most of us would look at this woman before she was photoshopped and go, wow, she's beautiful, her body's incredible. And yet there's still the need to Photoshop this, right? There's the media of these toddlers and tiaras. We saw this in the video, the photoshopped image of this model. This is the same model. This is a woman, Heidi Montag, who's had surgery after surgery after surgery to change her body because this wasn't good enough. And then this is a real woman who had surgery after surgery in order to make herself look more and more like Barbie. So these are the harmful stereotypes I talk about, the impossible norms. These bodies, nothing in this picture, nothing in any of these pictures are natural. Nothing here is natural. It's all made. These norms that media project are impossible without some sort of science, right? These are not normal in terms of natural. And so the media continues to perpetuate these ideas. The political issues that we see today is really the political representation or equality in politics. We need to increase representation in government positions. Women make up 51% of the population, and yet they're only about 20% of our overall government. So you can see in the image here, in the House of Representatives, there are only today it's actually a little bit up from here. Today, it's in 2015, it's 19.3% of the House of Representatives. There's 84 women in the House, but it's still not that far off from this. And then women make up, they have 20 seats in the Senate, and there are 100 senators total, so women make up 20% of the Senate. Yet they're 51% of the population. So we see a gap here, okay? So the political issues that we're dealing with today is the equality in politics, that we need to increase representation in government positions. And then there's the economic issues, and this is really focusing on jobs and pay. One of the key issues is equal pay. Right? In the 2014 State of the Union address, President Obama identified the fact that women today only make 77 cents to every dollar that a man makes. So this is still a major issue. That's nearly 25% less women are making. We have the Equal Pay Act of 1963, so that was passed. Employers were required to pay genders the same rate. But the reality is women end up being expected to take more time off work, or the reality is they have to take more time off work, right? Women are the only ones that can have babies if a couple wants to have a baby. So the woman has to take maternity leave. So she's missing work as a result and often losing pay. And there's still the expectation, certainly not for everybody, but the expectation from society is generally that women are going to stay home and take care of sick kids. So they're missing out on pay as a result of that. Also, the Equal Pay Act of 63 didn't answer the problem of women actually getting jobs to begin with. The Civil Rights Act of 64 said no discrimination in employment. While that applied to African Americans, it also applied to women. But just because the law was passed doesn't mean it's actually being enforced, right? So these economic issues are still a major concern today. Women today in 2015 are only making 77 cents to every dollar that a man is making. And then the last topic that we're covering today when we talk about modern issues are the reproductive rights. And the reproductive rights really tie to economic and social equality. It's the economic equality because it's the ability to work and the ability to work when one wants to and save up money for as long as one wants to. And then social equality, it's the idea of the right to control one's own body and not have an outside source tell one what one has to do with their body. So the first topic we talk about with reproductive rights is birth control. Even up through the 1950s, birth control was illegal in 30 states. It was actually initially used as a treatment of menstrual disorders. It was not originally used to prevent pregnancy. It was used to kind of regulate hormones. It gets introduced as a contraceptive, so that's to prevent pregnancy. That's what contraceptive means. Contra, against, conception, right? Conception is conceiving, the act of conceiving or making a baby. So it's introduced as a contraceptive and made legal in 1965. And this is really one of the realities why we see the sexual revolution of the late 1960s. But even though it gets made legal in 1965, it was still illegal for unmarried women until 1972. And so we see kind of this, there's still that stereotype put upon birth control. The economic impact of this is huge. Once women are able to control when and if they want to get pregnant, they have the ability to work as long as she wants without the risk of having to take time off because she's pregnant. She can save money and plan for a family. Some of the current issues that we're seeing regarding birth control is the access to birth control. Oftentimes, many health insurances refuse to even cover it. So women have to pay the full price out of pocket because the health insurance company won't pay for it. Also, we see some pharmacies refusing to even fill the prescription. So even if a woman gets a prescription for birth control, some pharmacies won't fill it. Another current issue is the morning after pill. This is a pill that's taken within 72 hours of unprotected sex, and it prevents implantation if an egg was fertilized. And the fear is, just like the fear with birth control, it's, oh my God, if women know they're not going to get pregnant, they're just going to go out and have sex with anybody they want, right? There's this fear of promoting promiscuity, of kind of encouraging women to sleep around because, that's what's going to happen if women take birth control or they know that the morning after pill is available to them. And again, this feeds into that social equality, that double standard. It's okay for men to be out there having sex, but women, that's not okay for women, right? That there's something inherently wrong with women if they're out there having sex. And then the other issue that we have to talk about when we're talking about reproductive rights is abortion. So in the mid-1800s, states began to outlaw abortions. There were approximately 1.2 million illegal abortions happening per year. And these were incredibly, incredibly dangerous. And I want you guys to understand that when we're talking about abortion here, there's kind of the argument is about choice and about control, right? So there's women's choice regarding her own health and her own body, and then there's society's control over that same body, and they argue for the health of the mother. And so this comes to a head in Roe v. Wade, which is a court case that gets decided in 1973. And the outcome of this case is Roe v. Wade recognized a woman's right to have an abortion. And they justify that. They said, look, the Constitution recognizes the right to privacy. And so that's one way that they said, yes, abortion is protected. But the court also recognized that the state has an interest in protecting the health of the mother and protecting the right of the unborn. And so they instituted what's called the trimester test. The trimester is that the pregnancy is divided into 3 sections. The first trimester is the first 3 months, the second 3 months, or the second trimester, and the third 3 months, or the third trimester. Well, in those first 3 months, or in the first trimester, the government is really, there's really little state regulation. The state really can't do much. Please understand that Roe v. Wade said, look, abortion is legal, but it's still left it up to the states to regulate it. And so in the first 3 months, there's very little that the government can actually regulate. The government needs to have a really, really good reason for restricting abortions within the first 3 months. Okay, so it can be something like, look, they have to go to a clinic, or they have to be in a sanitary location for the procedure. That can be something the state government can say. Well, in the second trimester, or the second 3 months, the government has more power to regulate abortions according to Roe v. Wade. And so that you can see here that government can regulate abortions for the health of the mother. And then in the third 3 months, the government can pretty much restrict abortions. Each state has the right, if they wanted to, they could say, look, no abortions in that third trimester or the last 3 months of pregnancy, because at that point, the fetus is viable. What that means is if that baby's born at that point, with some medical help, that fetus, that baby can live. Okay, so you're pretty much only able to get an abortion at this point if the life of the baby or the health of the mother is in danger. And so, really, though, the government can regulate, can restrict abortions in the third 3 months. This is according to Roe v. Wade in 1973. Well, a lot of controversy about abortion, and this eventually comes to another court case. It goes to court again, and then all the way to the Supreme Court, and we see Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And this passes in 1992, and these are ultimately the regulations under which we have now. So Roe v. Wade is not overturned, but it's kind of supplanted or taken over by Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And so Planned Parenthood versus Casey affirms the right to have an abortion, but it really gets rid of the trimester test. So what Planned Parenthood versus Casey says is states can restrict before that third trimester, but they cannot place undue burden. So they can put regulations to getting an abortion, but they can't make it too hard for women to have an abortion. The problem is, how do you, say what's too hard and what's not? So for example, Texas right now, Texas has some of the strictest laws. And so Texas says things like a woman has to have counseling that includes information designed to discourage her from having an abortion. And then that woman has to wait 24 hours before the procedure is actually provided. So after she receives the counseling, she has to wait 24 hours. There's also things like the parent of a minor must give consent and be notified before an abortion happens. This is in Texas. Public funding is only available in Texas for abortion in case of life endangerment, rape, or incest. So if a woman elects to have an abortion, she can't necessarily get state funding for it or any kind of public funding. Also, in Texas, a woman has to undergo an ultrasound before getting an abortion. And the provider must show and describe the image to the woman. And if the woman lives within 100 miles of an abortion provider, she must obtain the ultrasound at least 24 hours before the abortion. So again, I just want you guys to understand that these are restrictions put in place in Texas in particular. But some of the other restrictions we've seen are things like, the state can ensure an informed decision. So a patient has to watch a video or read publications about the process and about the procedure of the abortion. The state can require parental consent. These are the types of things that Planned Parenthood versus Casey allows, as long as it's not considered to be too difficult for a woman to get an abortion. The state can require these different things. So these are some of the current issues, even still today. So parental consent, that comes up in California every few years. I think the last time was like Prop 85. I'm pretty sure it was 2006. And it hasn't passed. It never has in California. But that means that if you have to inform the parent of a kid who's getting an abortion. RU486 is a pill that triggers a miscarriage, and that's still one of the current issues regarding abortion. And this is the pill, the RU486 is really a spontaneous abortion. You need a prescription for it, and it's really controversial because it's harder to regulate. It's just a pill. You go home, you take the pill, and that's it. You don't need to go to a clinic for a procedure. And so the idea is, again, that all of this, the fear in society, right, is that it's going to lead to more promiscuity. It's going to lead to more women sleeping around because they don't have to worry about getting pregnant anymore. And so we see this kind of conflict between women who argue that they want to be able to make their own choice regarding their own bodies versus society's kind of desire to control and the society kind of expectation of what a true woman is, even today in 2015. So these are the modern issues that the women's rights movement is dealing with, right? Gender equality, political representation, equal pay, and then reproductive rights and the ability to control one's own body.